In the morning, I treated myself to a big breakfast to fortify myself for another long day's drive. Breakfast is, of course, a most savage event in Western society. If you hesitate to agree, then I urge you to name me another occasion, any occasion at all, when you would happily devour an embryo. And Australians seem to have a good fix on this. A lot of it comes down to a mastery of bacon. Unlike the curled shoe tongues that are consumed in Britain, or the boringly crisp regimented strips we go for in America, Australian bacon has a rough, meaty, fair dinkum heartiness. It looks as if it was taken off the pig while it was trying to escape. You can almost hear the squeal in every bite. Lovely. Also, they cut their toast thick. In short, the Australians know what they are about with breakfast. And so, radiant with cholesterol and contentment, I returned to the lonesome road. Beyond hay, the landscape was even more impossibly flat, brown, empty, and dull. The monumental emptiness of Australia is not easy to convey. It is far and away the most thinly peopled of nations. It is far and away the most thinly peopled of nations. In Britain, the average population density is 632 people per square mile. In the United States, the average is 76. Across the world as a whole, it is 117. And just for interest, in Macau, the record holder, it is decidedly snug 69,000 people per square mile. The Australian average, by contrast, is 6 people per square mile. But even that modest figure is wildly skewed because, of course, Australians overwhelmingly live in a few clustered spots along the coast and leave the rest of the country undisturbed. Indeed, the proportion of people in Australia who live in urban area is at 86%, about as high as in Holland and nearly as high as in Hong Kong. Out here, if you found 6 people occupying the same square mile, it would be either a family reunion or an Om Shindikyo planning session. From time to time, I passed through long miles of mallee scrub, low shrubs just bushy enough and high enough to strangle any view, and very occasionally in the open plain I would spy a low line of vivid green on the right-hand horizon, which I presumed marked an irrigated zone along the Murrumbidgee. Otherwise nothing, just hard earth that strained to support a little dry grass and the odd thorny acacia or acacia or bent eucalypt. It wasn't always so. Although inland Australia has never been exactly verdant, much of the marginal land once experienced periods of relative lushness, sometimes lasting years, occasionally lasting decades, and it enjoyed a natural resiliency that let it spring back after droughts. Then, in 1859, a man named Thomas Austin a landowner in Winchelsea, Victoria, a little south of where I was now, made a big mistake. He imported 24 wild rabbits from England and released them into the bush for sport. It is hardly a novel observation that rabbits breed with a certain keenness. Within a couple of years, they had entirely overrun Austin's property and were spreading into neighboring districts. 50 million years of isolation had left Australia without a single predator or parasite able even to recognize rabbits, much less dine off them, and so they proliferated amazingly. Collectively, their appetite was essentially insatiable. By 1880, 2 million acres of Victoria had been picked clean. Soon they were pushing into South Australia and New South Wales, advancing over the landscape at a rate of 75 miles per year. Until the rabbits came, much of the countryside where I was driving now was characterized by lush groves of Eremophila, a shrub that grew to a height of about 7 feet and was in flower for most of the year. It was by all accounts a beauty, and its leaves a boon to nibbling creatures. But rabbits fell on the Eremophila like locusts, devouring every bit of them, leaves, flowers, barks, stems, until none were to be found. The rabbits ate so much of everything that sheep and other livestock were forced to extend both their range and their diet, punishing yet wider expanses. As sheep yields fell, farmers perversely compensated by increasing stocking levels, adding to the general devastation. The problem would have been acute enough, but in the 1890s, after 40 unusually green years, Australia fell into a murderous decade-long drought, the worst in its recorded history. As the earth cracked and turned to dust, the topsoil, already the thinnest in the world, blew away, never to be replenished. In the course of the decade, some 35 million sheep, more than half the nation's total, perished. 16 million went in a single pitiless year, 1902. The rabbits, meanwhile, hopped on. By the time science finally came up with a solution, almost a century had passed since Thomas Austin tipped his 24 bunnies out of the bag. The weapon deployed against the rabbits was a miracle virus from South America called myxomatosis. Harmless to humans and other animals, it was phenomenally devastating to rabbits, with a mortality rate of 99.9%. Almost at once, the countryside filled with twitching, stumbling, very sick rabbits, and then with tens of millions of little corpses. Although just one rabbit in a thousand survived, those few that did were naturally resistant to myxomatosis, and it was resistant genes that they passed on when they began to breed again. It took a while for things to get rolling, but today Australia's rabbit numbers are back to 300 million and climbing fast. At all events, the damage to the landscape, much of it permanent and irreversible, had already been done. And also, some clown could have something to at pop at from his veranda. And also, some clown could have something to pop at from his veranda. Just as you plunge into emptiness with startling abruptness in Australia, so you plunge out of it again. Shortly after crossing into South Australia in mid-afternoon, I found myself entering rolling hills of orange groves. It was so startling I got out and had a look. On one side stretched arid emptiness, a plain of stretched burlap spattered with clumps of mallee. But before me, filling the view to the distant horizon, spread a biblical-looking promised land, citrus groves and vineyards and vegetable patches in every lush shade of green. As I pushed on, the balance between orchards and vineyards tipped increasingly in favor of the latter until eventually there was nothing but vineyards, and I realized I had reached the Barossa Valley, a quite spectacularly pretty corner of Australia with rolling hills of abundant green that gave it, literally and metaphorically, a Mediterranean air. It was mostly settled by German farmers who started Australia's wine industry here. Today, Australians are among the most wine-savvy people on earth, but that development is quite recent. A story often recounted is how the British wine expert Len Evans, on a visit to the country in the 1950s, asked for a glass of wine in a country hotel. The hotelier regarded him narrowly for a long moment and asked, What are you? Some kind of poop?" Even now, the wines for which the Barossa is celebrated, Chardonnay, Cabernet Sauvignon, and Shiraz, are all recent arrivals. Into the 1980s, the government was paying growers to uproot Shiraz vines and produce sticky, sweet Rieslings. I've never quite understand why tourists from the more prosperous end of the market are so drawn to wine-growing areas. They wouldn't, presumably, want to go and see cotton before it became LL Bean slacks or caviar being gutted from sturgeon, but give them a backdrop of vines and they appear to think they have found heaven. Having said that, the Barossa Valley is awfully appealing, particularly after a couple of days on the lonely and far-flung Sturt Highway. I stopped for the night in Tanunda, a handsome and well-touristed little town, mostly built along one very long street, fetchingly shadowed with leafy trees. Given its popularity with tourists and its Germanic beginnings, I had rather feared that Tanunda would be themed accordingly, but apart from one or two restaurants with house in their titles and the odd mention of Wurst in shop windows, there was mercifully little attempt to exploit its heritage. It was the eve of Australia Day, the big national holiday, and Tanunda was busy with people who had come for a mini break. I found the room, not without some difficulty, then wandered to the main street for a stroll before dinner. It was crowded with people who, like me, were trying to fill that empty hour between the shops closing and the moment when one night, with propriety, started to drink. When the moment when one might, with propriety, start to drink. I walked among them, happy to be back in civilization, happy above all to be able to eavesdrop on conversations that didn't involve sheep dip, temperamental machinery, new wells, or land clearance, or rumps, sumps, pumps, and stumps as I had begun to think of it. It was clear from the conversation that I had landed in Yuppieville. Most were engaged in the interesting middle-class pastime of identifying all the objects in shop windows that looked like objects belonging to people they knew. Wherever I lingered, I could hear someone observing, "Oh, look, Sarah's got the bowl just like that," or "Your mother used to have a tea service like that once, like that one. I wonder whatever became of it. You don't suppose she gave it to Samantha, do you?" A few couples were playing a slightly edgier version of this game, which involved supplementary comments like, "No, the one you broke was much nicer," and "But how many pairs of pearl earrings do you need, for God's sake?" and "Well, if she didn't give it to Samantha, I'm going to be extremely if she did give it to Samantha, I'm going to be extremely pissed off, frankly, because she promised it to me. You'll just have to have a word with her." These were the people, I guessed, who had driven the farthest to get here and most needed a drink, or possibly were just assholes. I liked Tanunda and had a very pleasant evening there, but there was absolutely nothing exceptional or eventful in the experience, so I am going to tell you instead a little story related to me by a lovely woman named Kathleen Veitch. Kathleen Veitch was my oldest friend in Australia, both in the sense that she was my first chum there and also that she was just about old enough to be my mother. I met her at the Melbourne Writers' Festival in 1992. I can't remember the circumstances now other than that she approached me after a reading, either to set me straight with regard to some mistake I had made in one of my books on language. She was of a scholarly bent and impatient with sloppiness, or to enlighten me concerning some aspect of Australian life on which I had imprudently commented in a question and answer session. The upshot is that we had a cup of tea in a cafeteria and that the next day I took a tram to her house in St. Kilda for lunch, where I met most of her family. Her children, of whom she seemed to have a large but indeterminate number, were all grown and living away, but most of them called in at various points in the afternoon to borrow a tool or check for messages or to borrow in the fridge. It was just a kind of household I had always longed to grow up in. Happy, comfortable, nicely chaotic, full of shouted conversations of the "try looking in the cupboard at the top of the stairs" type. And I liked Kathleen very much. She was kind and funny and thoughtful and direct. So we became great friends, though it was a friendship based almost entirely on correspondence. She had never been to America, and I went to Australia once a year if I was lucky, and not always to Melbourne. But 3 or 4 times a year she would send me a long, wonderfully discursive letters hammered out on a jumpy and willful typewriter. These letters seldom took less than an hour to read. In a single page, they could range over a galaxy of subjects: her childhood in Adelaide, the inadequacies of certain politicians, actually of most politicians, why Australians lack confidence, what her children had been up to. Generally, she stuck in a wadding of clippings from The Age, the Melbourne newspaper. Much of what I knew about Australia I learned from her. I loved those letters. They came from so far away. Just getting an envelope from Australia still seemed to me a faintly wondrous event, and described experiences that were unexceptional to her but breathtakingly exotic to me. Taking a tram into the city, suffering through a heat wave in December, attending a lecture at the Royal Melbourne Institute, shopping for curtains at David Jones, the big local department store. I can't explain it except to say that without giving up any part of the life I had already, I wanted intensely to have all that in my life as well. So it was through her letters, more than from almost anything else, that I consolidated my fixation with Australia. Her letters were always happy, but the last one I received from her was exceptionally sunny. Especially sunny. She and John, her husband, were about to sell the house in St. Kilda and move to the Mornington Peninsula, south of Melbourne, to take up a life of gracious retirement beside the sea, fulfilling a dream of very long standing. Just after she sent that letter, to the shock of everyone who knew her, she suffered a sudden heart attack and died. I'd have been on my way to visit her now. Instead, all I can offer is my favorite of the many stories she told me. In the 1950s, a friend of Kathleen's moved with her young family into a house next door to a vacant lot. One day, a construction crew turned up to build a house on the lot. Kathleen's friend had a 4-year-old daughter who naturally took an interest in all the activity going on next door. She hung around on the margins, and eventually the construction workers adopted her as a kind of mascot. They chatted to her and gave her little jobs to do, and at the end of the week presented her with a little packet containing a shiny new half-crown. She took this home to her mother, who made all the appropriate cooings of admiration and suggested that they take it to the bank the next morning to deposit it in her account. When they went to the bank, the teller was equally impressed and asked the little girl how she had come by her own pay packet. I have building a house this week, she replied proudly. Goodness, said the teller, and will you be building a house next week too? I will if we ever get the fucking bricks, answered the little girl.